Hey friends, so today we are going to be trying to solve the biggest puzzle that has faced humanity for the past 2,000 plus years. What to do with Jesus Christ. Did he really rise from the dead, proving that he was the savior of the world? Or was this the biggest hoax in history? Let's figure this out. Oh, wait, hold on. Why is this even important? Well, it's important because Christianity is hinged around the resurrection. If the resurrection happened, Christianity is true. But if it didn't happen, like this verse says, then it's false, and all Christian followers are the most deceived people in the world. Okay, let's get back to the mission at hand, which is solving the puzzle, this case about what to do with Jesus. Part number 1 of our case will be identifying the facts of the case, the different evidences. And number 2 would be looking at the evidences that we've accumulated and figuring out the best explanation for these evidences. In order to accomplish this mission, we're going to be using abductive reasoning, that is, reasoning to the best explanation of the evidence, like any good historian, scientist, or detective does. Once we have all the evidence, we're going to put forward a bunch of different theories and see which ones can account for the evidences that we have, and contrarily, we'll see which ones are unreasonable and should be dismissed. So let's do it. These are the facts of the case. And by the way, all of these facts are facts put forward and agreed upon by the vast majority of scholars, and even the most skeptical atheistic scholars would still agree to all these evidences. So we're playing on a fair playing field here. Fact number 1, a death by crucifixion. This is simply saying that Jesus really did die by crucifixion. Fact number 2, ladies find the empty tomb. This is simply showing that the tomb of Jesus was empty and no one ever produced the body. Fact number 3, independent appearances of Jesus alive after his crucifixion. This is simply stating that people did at least make claims to have experienced the risen Jesus after his crucifixion. Number 4, violence endured by the apostles. Another way to say this is the transformed lives of the apostles after what they claimed as their alleged observations and appearances of Jesus after his death. And number 5 would be the enemies of Christ were converted. Specifically, we'll be focusing on James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul, the persecutor of Christians. Okay, now I'm going to go back and give about 30 seconds for each fact and back them up with proof on why people do accept these. For Jesus' death by crucifixion, how do we even know this happened? First off, even the Journal of the American Medical Association states that clearly the weight of evidence indicates that Jesus was dead even before the wound to his side was inflicted. You even have skeptical leading scholars in the field saying that historically it's indisputable that Jesus was dead. That's Gerd Ludemann. We also have early 1st and 2nd century historians outside of the Bible writing about Jesus' death. Okay, what about the empty tomb? Well, funny fact is, if this wasn't the case and it really wasn't an empty tomb, don't you think that the enemies would have gone in and just pulled the body out and said, there's no empty tomb, here's the body? The enemies even tried to say that the disciples stole the body, once again admitting that the body wasn't there. And one of the things that is specific to this context in history is that women's testimony wasn't really regarded as trustworthy. That's just the way that it was during this time. So having that there in the Gospels was not something that added credibility, but it was something that actually took away from their credibility. But in this case, because it is such an embarrassing fact, historians give that more credibility. Okay, but what about the appearances of Jesus after his death? Well, you have scholars like James D.G. Dunn. He is stating that these creedal statements that are in 1 Corinthians 15 can be dated back within the first year after the resurrection. And let's not forget that we have really early testimony in the Gospels, such as Mark and Luke, of people claiming these experiences of the risen Jesus. So what about the fact about the violence endured by the apostles? Well, you can even find in other historians, not even in the New Testament, about the violence endured by the apostles. Okay, lastly, the enemies that were converted. You have in this situation, Paul. Paul was someone that was going town to town persecuting Christians because he was such a devout Jew, and he thought that Christianity was a heresy that was going to tear the people down. Even for the stoning of Stephen, he cited being there holding people's coats while they were stoning one of the followers of Christ. This is the person that ended up becoming one of the strongest followers of Christ that we have in history. And he didn't have a change in heart. He doesn't claim a change in heart. He claims the fact that he experienced the risen Jesus as the reason for his change. And number 2, we have the brother of Jesus, James. During his life, Jesus' brothers didn't believe that he was the Messiah or anything close to that. And they actually mocked him, and that can be cited in the Gospels as well. But then for some reason, the same brother that mocked him ended up being a brother that believed him later in life because of a claim of experiencing this risen Jesus as well. Like, what would it take to convince you that your sibling was the savior of the world? All right, friends, I hope you're still with me. We have the facts on the table, part 1 accomplished. Now we're on to part 2, which is evaluating some theories that might explain this evidence. Theory number 1, the swoon theory. This is a theory that Jesus never actually died on the cross, but was only very, very injured. However, this falls short of accounting for fact number 1, that Jesus really was dead on the cross. Also, if you look at the description of their experiences with the risen Jesus after he rose, it wasn't that he was, mauling around barely, like they were healing him and taking care of him. No, he was walking with them, talking with them, even eating with them. Another thing to think about in regards to this is this doesn't really account for the conversion of the enemies of Christ. Think of Paul. How would that convince Paul? And a half-dead Jesus isn't a very inspiring Jesus. Why would the apostles go and then give their lives and commit their lives and lose everything for this truth if it was just that Jesus was barely alive and, coughing up blood? Okay, let's try again. Theory number 2. This is the twin theory. This is a theory that Jesus really did die on the cross, but he had a twin. He had a twin that came and convinced the disciples that, Jesus really had rose from the dead. But this doesn't account for the missing body in the empty tomb. Also, if you look at the description like that of Thomas, his experience of the risen Jesus after death, he says that Jesus came to him and said, "Hey, put your hands in my wounds. You can see that I am that Jesus." So clearly he still had the wounds. So it's the same person. Don't you think that Mary, Jesus' mother, would have known this best? Or what about Jesus' brothers, James and Jude, that were also converted and followers of Christ? And if you look at situations where people are really conned, it's in areas where they don't have much expertise. Who has better expertise than the followers of Jesus that had been following him? Theory number 3. This is the mass hallucination theory. And it's a theory that essentially states that people didn't experience the risen Jesus after his crucifixion. No, it was a mass hallucination that they experienced. However, this doesn't account for the empty tomb, and there have been no cited reports ever in history of mass hallucinations. 3, if you look at people's descriptions of experiencing the risen Jesus, they were in different areas at different times and to different groups of people. So you'd have to have different groups of people having mass hallucinations, which scholars would say is a bigger miracle than the resurrection itself. Theory number 4, this is the spiritual resurrection theory. This theory states that, they didn't really mean for like a bodily resurrection. They were talking about more of like a spiritual resurrection of Jesus. However, this doesn't account for the empty tomb. And if you look at the descriptions of people that experienced the risen Jesus, it was very tactile, very real stuff. You even find the teaching of the early Christians about like their own resurrection and their boldness and their courage and their willingness to endure violence. I don't think they would be doing that if they think they just saw a ghost. Okay, once again, we know the facts. We're going to be evaluating theory number 5, which is the wrong tomb theory. Essentially stating that, the disciples went to the wrong tomb. And this doesn't account for things like the enemies of Christ converted. You have to take into consideration that the Romans and the Jewish authorities at the time were trying to, snuff out and really just put to rest all the chaos and stuff going on, and that's why they put a Roman guard to guard the tomb. So don't you think that they would have easily just went to the right tomb and pulled out the right body and said, no, like, the guy's still dead? This also doesn't account for the independent appearances of Jesus after the resurrection. We're doing the hard work of detectives. We're looking at evidence and we're trying to draw conclusions. Here's another theory that we should evaluate. It's called the legend theory. Essentially, like, wasn't this all a legend? Wasn't this a legend embellished and details added and changed over time? Well, as we talked about before in 1 Corinthians 15, the creedal statements that are within the first year of the resurrection, 1 year is not enough time to develop a legend. Even skeptical scholars affirm that the early church was, teaching these things very early on. And what about the empty tomb? How could the myth theory explain the conversion of Paul? Okay, we're down to our final theory. This is the conspiracy theory. And it's the theory that just simply states, maybe the disciples made it all up. Maybe they just made it all up and fooled everyone. But my question would be, for what? They lack motive. To gain what? These people didn't gain anything. They lost everything. All they did was give. All they did was give. They gave even their own lives and their suffering. For what? For a lie? This doesn't make any sense. Also, if it was a conspiracy theory, you wouldn't have women finding the tomb. Like we said earlier, because of the context of the time, women were not trustworthy sources. And so if you were making the story up, you wouldn't have that because it's an embarrassing fact. But for historians, embarrassing facts adds to the credibility of the statement. How would their own lies transform them into courageous evangelists? All right, friends, we set out on this case, right? We set out on this case to solve the biggest puzzle that has been plaguing humanity for the past 2,000 years. What to do with this Jesus? We've looked at 7 theories already that all seem to fall short and have been put in the category as dismissed as unreasonable. So there's one last theory for us to evaluate, and let's see if it has any problems. This theory is simply that the disciples, accurately reported history, that Jesus really did rise from the dead. But there is one problem with this theory. It requires a belief in the supernatural. If someone has a pre-existing bias against the supernatural, saying, no supernatural thing could ever exist, there is no supernatural world, and no one has evidence to believe so, and I will never believe in anything supernatural. If someone says that, then yes, I can see how, this conclusion doesn't carry much warrant towards them. But I would say to that person that they should reevaluate this bias on the basis of 3 things. The evidence for the existence of God, the empirically cited studies of near-death experiences and what that might entail. And number 3, the evidence that we looked at here. I think that certainly this does point to the fact that maybe a supernatural world exists. But for the majority of people that already believe that a supernatural world exists, they believe in some kind of God and some kind of afterlife, then you do have your best explanation for the evidence here that Jesus really did rise from the dead, proving that he was the Savior of the world. And that is big. That is huge. But let's be honest. Let's be honest, here together. Most people don't deny Christianity because of evidential reasons, at least not primarily. At least in my own experience, that's what I've seen. It's usually more of a volitional reason, meaning their freedom of choice. Until one moves from belief that the resurrection happened to belief in Jesus, the Messiah and Savior of the world, no change will really happen. But think about this, okay? Think about this with me. If Jesus really did rise from the dead, which I think we proved here today, I think we showed here today, that has implications that tells us a lot about this God that runs the universe, that made everything and made you. Even Jesus said that he came here to do this for the good of humanity, so that they could enter back into relationship with God without guilt or shame. I think that this shows that Jesus is trustworthy, worthy of your trust, worthy of your loyalty, and worthy as a guide for our life. I myself, as an atheist, went through a very similar situation like we went through here today. I took 18 months, evaluated a ton of evidence for the existence of God, and from science, history, psychology, philosophy, and I came down after gathering all this evidence about all these different religions and whether or not God even exists, and I said, what is the best explanation for all these evidences, individually and as a whole? And I came down to conclude that Christianity accounts for this evidence the best. And so I started following Jesus, but I didn't start following Jesus right away. I assented the fact that it was true, but it wasn't until I started reading the words in the New Testament and seeing more about what Jesus said about me, about why my self-sufficiency was not good and why my independence was leading to so much failure. I think probably like you've tried to live your life independently and away from God, making your own rules and being your own God and deciphering right for wrong for you. And I'm just gonna ask, hey, how's that going? I know in my own life it wasn't holding warrant. It wasn't going well. I could look back and see a wake of hurt and shame brought on by me towards others and myself. We have demolished here today the intellectual reasons why you're not going to follow Jesus and why Jesus didn't rise from the dead. So now, intellectual reasons aside, figure out why wouldn't you follow such a trustworthy and loving God, especially if it's true. I'm telling you that I am experiencing life to the fullest. I don't have to, work for my salvation like my Muslim friends in Islam. No, I work from a point of salvation out of gratitude for what God has done for me. I don't have to pretend like suffering doesn't exist, that evil doesn't exist, like my Buddhist friends might. No, God affirmed the suffering because he came down and suffered with us and suffered for us. Hey, Jesus is worthy of your trust, so you can stop trying to run from him in independence. We will continue to knock down intellectual barriers so that you're faced with what it comes down to at the end of the day, where this all got started, the freedom of choice. And so I live in freedom, I live lightly, and I walk with the God of the universe. That's the whole purpose of this channel. The whole purpose of this channel is because I think that I want you to experience that life as well. I see my generation is suffering. So many of you, depression, anxiety, self-image issues. Like, I see you on TikTok, I see you on Instagram, I see you on YouTube, just trying to make life, trying to be gods and make life for yourself, and it's not going well. And my heart breaks for you. When I'm with you and I love you, and that's why I made this channel. Yes, I will be demolishing false ideologies as they stand against truth, because I'm an intellectual Christian that follows truth. It just so happens that truth is a person, the person of Jesus. He is the way, the truth, and the life, and nobody comes to the Father except through him. And so, since Jesus is the only way, I want to share that with you. And so I will be, yes, demolishing all false ideologies that stand against truth, but only for the sake of paving a way so that you and I can walk on the path of spiritual formation. I'm sure, as you know, you can get caught up in the world of just debating ideas all the time, but ideas are only helpful when they become practical in the real life, and you get to live out this new life as this new person, living, from a transformed identity, knowing that you are made in the image of God and that you can put your identity in that. Yes, this is the life, and this is the purpose. And so if you want to follow me as I follow Christ, please do so, because his words to you are the same as they were to me. Essentially, he's asking you, will you follow me? And that's where we're at. If this is the first time you've ever even made that choice, that you want to say, yeah, I do want to follow Christ. I'm tired of the self-sufficiency, independence, and trusting in myself over God. I'm enough, I'm fed up, and it's time for something new. Can you comment that down below so that I can pray for you, so that others can pray for you? We're excited. Welcome to the family. This is what you were made for. You were made to walk in dependence with the God of the universe, and Jesus made a way for that to happen. Here we are. We solved the case. We solved the puzzle of the biggest question in history, and now the choice is yours. What will you do? Will you follow him?